Good morning. Thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Carol Letofsky, and I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. This is the story of how my German mother, the survivor of the Nazis, ended up in Grand Forks, North Dakota. My mother, Irma Heimann Stern, known in the United States as Irma, was born in 1909 in Homburg am Main, Germany. And what you see in front of you are two very nice pictures of my mother, one as a young woman and one in her 90s. Homburg was and is a small farming village on a river called the Main, with a hilly landscape, which allows for the growth of grapes for production of wine. There were 15 Jewish families in the village of 450 people, and their Jewish ancestors had been in the village since the 1750s. And now a picture of the town where my mother lived. They had lived in this village comfortably with their Christian neighbors. Irma attended elementary school at a Catholic church taught by nuns. There she learned to read, do math, and write. At the time, young girls spent most of their school time learning skills like sewing, baking, cooking, and general homemaking skills. This is a picture of some of the handiwork my mother did as a very young child. There's also a recipe in German, and this is a recipe for dumplings made in a skillet and served with berries, and they were a childhood favorite of mine. Irma grew up with two older brothers, parents, and assorted aunts, uncles, cousins, and had a nice childhood. She enjoyed taking care of the family chickens, cow, and a vegetable garden. She had very few toys, but was incredibly happy to have one doll. Unfortunately, her brothers were roughhousing one day and ripped off the doll's head. Irma never had another doll, but she still adored her brothers. And this is the one and only picture of my mother with her brothers in Germany. Irma's father, my grandfather Abraham, fought in World War I as he was loyal to Germany, and you can see him here in his uniform. In the mid-1930s, things got bad for anyone of the Jewish faith, even in tiny villages like Homburg. Irma's two brothers were able to get visas to go to America. Brother Manny came to the United States first, and the picture you see now is of some of the Nazi soldiers marching. Manny came to the United States in July of 1937, and Brother Eric came on June 30th, 1938. Both settled in New York City. My mother was not sure she would ever see her brothers again. The brothers immediately began working to try to get visas for my mother and her mother. This was not easy, as there were many requests. It was expensive, as all the paperwork, passages, places to stay had to be paid in advance. Limited numbers of visas to enter the United States were given. It required constant perseverance by her brothers for 3 years to obtain visas. On November 9th, 1938, the Nazis came to my mother's town. This date is now known as Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. They burned down the synagogue where the family worshiped. This is a picture of a destroyed synagogue. It is not my mother's, but another in the region. The Nazi terrorists came to my mother's home and destroyed the inside of it. They broke everything that could be broken. My mom and grandmother were hiding in the cellar under a trap door while this was happening. The Nazis took away all the Jewish men and older boys to concentration camps and labor camps. After the Nazis left, my mother and grandmother waited for morning and went to the home of friends in a close-by town for shelter. But that next night, the same thing happened. This was the second night of Kristallnacht destruction, and this home was also ransacked. The Nazi officials then came to my mother and told her she had to clean up her former home so Nazis could move in. It was common for the Nazis to destroy stores and homes and then force the owners to clean up the mess. It was meant to degrade them. She did this and then went to live with her mother and 3 large families in a small, rundown house. My mother was then ordered to Gestapo headquarters and told to sign over her family farm and house to them. And next we have a picture of the Gestapo. Irma would not sign as she felt the farm also belonged to her brothers and wanted their okay. This was a big mistake, as the Nazis did not like an answer of no. In addition, this was a time in history where women did not take bold positions. My mother felt she was doing the right thing for her brothers by refusing. As you can see, this building is very imposing and stark. The Nazis gave my mother a choice of going to a concentration camp or working as unpaid slave labor at a farm and vineyard. Irma was liked in the village and so was allowed to make this choice. Irma worked in the vineyard from early morning to late at night, carrying heavy metal containers of insecticides up and down hills, pruning vines, and doing very hard work. Irma believed that if she did all the hard labor asked of her, that in time her 2 brothers would obtain the paperwork to allow she and her mother to immigrate. She had great backbone and resolve and worked hard so she would not be noticed and considered lazy. Times continued to get worse for the Jews as they had anything of value taken from them, wore yellow stars on their clothing to show they were Jewish, and feared deportation to concentration camps or immediate death. Irma often mentioned a cousin was shot to death in front of her during this time, and other family members taken away to concentration camps. Irma's brothers got visas for she and her mother in 1940. The Nazis would not sign the passport for Irma since she had not turned over her land. Her mother Matilda got a passport, but would not leave without her daughter. This is what we could call or refer to as a choiceless choice. Irma again made a trip to the Gestapo, which was a very brave and scary thing to do. A trip to the Gestapo was risking being killed on the spot. My mother's bravery in doing this is something I do not think I would have the guts to do. Irma had to introduce herself as Irmengard Sarah Heimann. All Jewish women had to use Sarah as a middle name. She asked to sign papers and did so. When I asked my mother how she was able to again avoid being shipped to a concentration camp at this point, she said the Nazi official in charge of her village knew she had a reputation as a very hard worker and figured they needed her to be working in the village and the fields as a slave more than at a camp. My mother continued to show what we would call real grit and continued to do hard labor so she could get her passport and depart with her mother. Meanwhile, the man whom my mother would eventually marry in the United States worked in Stuttgart, Germany. His name was Max. Max and brother Leo owned a small pants factory. The brothers lived a normal life of bachelors, which included parties, dances, and hiking in the Alps. And pictured here is my father's hiking stick, which I still have, a top hat, which is now the property of the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and a picture of my dad in the Alps. It is a favorite of mine. Leo and Max got word there would be a Nazi attack on many small towns, including that of their sister Irma. Now I'm going to introduce the second Irma. On this slide on the right, you see my father's family, and that includes a sister Irma. On the left is my mother's family, and my mother is our other Irma, referred to as Irmgard or Irmengard. Irma lived with her husband Adolf and children Helen and Julius in a village called Edelfingen, which was 75 miles from Stuttgart. To avoid detection, the 2 brothers drove at night without car lights to the town to take their sister Irma and children Helen and Julius away. Adolf hid in ditches away from the town. They took their family to their mother's home in Holbach. Again, they drove without lights to avoid detection by the Nazis. This is a map of the route my father and his his brother Julius took to get from Stuttgart to the different towns, and we're showing it as in relationship to Frankfurt, which some of you may be familiar with. Again, as they say, they were driving to their mother's home, and the town of Hohebach was only 25 miles from actually where my future mother and future father lived apart. They were that close. My two cousins, as we look at the picture of Hohebach, my two cousins, Helen and Julius, are still alive. Helen told me she felt the ride to her grandmother's in the middle of the night was an adventure. On the other hand, her brother Julius slept the whole way there. This is the picture on the left of the home in Hohebach. This house still exists, and I was able to see it about 7 years ago. And on the right, you're seeing a picture of my father. He's on the far right, his brother Leo in the middle, and his brother Julius on the left. After this episode, Max and Leo made immediate plans to find a way out of Germany for the family and into the United States. A younger brother, Julius, had been sponsored by cousins in the United States and immigrated earlier. The sponsoring cousins were wagon trainers into North Dakota in the mid-1880s. North Dakota had lots of open land, and anyone willing to settle in this remote, cold state could have free land. Julius and the cousins were determined to save the family members, and with lots of paperwork were able to get visas for Max and Leo, plus sister Irma and family. They were able to immigrate to the United States in April 1938. Max and family members arrived in New York, but immediately all left for Grand Forks, North Dakota, where brother Julius and cousins lived and had guaranteed employment for brothers Max and Leo. By 1941, my mother and grandmother were desperate to get out of Germany. Jews were being rounded up in all the towns and being taken for extermination in concentration camps. They knew the Nazis would soon come for them. On May 17, 1941, my mother still had no passport, but had to trust in faith, and with her mother took a train to Frankfurt. Again, courage and absolute need to get out of Germany allowed her to get on that train without a passport. My mom and grandmother had nothing but a straw basket filled with some clothing and keepsakes. In Frankfurt, a man was to bring my mother a passport. She was one of 3 people in a train car of 100 Jewish people without a passport. The picture you have in front of you now on the right is the passport that my mother was able to get, and the straw basket, which contained the only belongings they had. And this straw basket exists to this day. In Frankfurt, a man handed her the passport you see on the right through a train car window. We assume he was part of an underground group to help victims like my mother. The next stop was Berlin, where the passengers were searched for valuables. Then on to Paris, from there to Spain, and then Lisbon, Portugal, where my mother felt free. She said she ate her first olive in Lisbon. Irma and her mother got, passage on a freighter in the hold. Only women were in the hold. This is the map, as you can see, of the route they had to take. There was great danger from landmines planted in the ocean to destroy ships. Within 7 days of my mother leaving her village of Hamburg, the 8 remaining Jews there were rounded up, taken to a camp, and killed. My mother and grandmother escaped this roundup with only days to spare, and I believe the persistence of my mother's brothers in obtaining the visas and my mother's determination to get through the days of slave labor got her to this point. On June 14, 1941, my mother arrived in New York City, and her brother took her and her mother in. My mom found work darning holes in nylon stockings. She really did not like this work, as she was used to being outside all the time. Just about this time, my father Max was arriving in New York City on a business trip. He was still single, and his sister Irma fixed him up with a woman new to the country, my mother Irma. After a 3-week romance, they married, and my father took his new wife, Irma, to Grand Forks, North Dakota, where he lived. The train ride to Grand Forks took 5 days. This is a picture of my mother and father when they got married. The train ride took 5 days, and Irma had no idea where she was going, but did not care because she was out of the Nazi hell. She had no idea what a North Dakota was or where. And here you see the route. They arrived in New York. From New York, they did overnight in Chicago and stayed at the Palmer House, by the way. She had no idea what a North Dakota was or where. Again, willingness to take a risk on a new life in an unknown place was what Irma did. A hearty attitude and fearlessness described my mother. Grand Forks was full of immigrants from Norway and Sweden. The farmland of the Red River Valley was similar to where my mother came from in Germany. Instead of hills with vineyards, there were flat fields with wheat. And here you see the welcome sign to North Dakota and to Greater Grand Forks. The cold, snowy winters were also similar to Germany's Bavarian climate. Most important, people welcomed her, taught her English, and helped her adjust to life in the United States. Irma was a wonderful baker, cook, seamstress, and gardener. Everyone loved the special treats she shared, and especially the delicious Christmas butter cookies she brought to all her new friends. In time, she became a 4-H leader, helping young girls learn to sew, cook, and bake. 4-H was a popular organization for boys and girls in this farming region. Irma had great difficulty talking about the Holocaust and what happened to her and her mother. She would talk about the night of broken glass with certain people, but not family. She told the story to some children, ages about 12 to 14. I think in hopes they would remember what can happen when hate takes over, but you have to fight for survival. In her 90s, she would occasionally share something about the Holocaust with a visiting friend. I read a book called The Prague Sonata by Bradford Moreau, and he writes, being a survivor meant that you lived to some degree in a chronic state of mourning, like a low-level fever that waxes and wanes, but is never truly eliminated. This describes the fact that my mother would repeatedly make lists of all the people she knew who were murdered in the hands of the Nazis. This numbered 57 aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends. Irma especially felt badly about an aunt named Zilly. Zilly was not allowed to immigrate because she was what they called at the time a hunchback. The Nazis believed anyone with a physical or mental defect should be euthanized. Zilly was taken to a concentration camp and killed. Irma was very cautious in what she said to people and did not ever want to attract attention to herself. Some people might call her shy, but I think staying on the radar, under the radar, was a tool she used to stay alive in Germany and was comfortable for her in the United States. My mother always felt that with the right circumstances in the world, something like the Nazi terror could happen again. I believe that my mother's hard work in the fields, reputation in her village as a good worker, her desire to reunite with her brothers, and a fearless spirit gave her the will and guts to deal with the horrible things happened around her. This was coupled with a very strong belief in God. This picture is my mother celebrating her 100th birthday. And on the right, there is a picture of many of the family members who came in to celebrate. And two of the cousins I mentioned who went on the overnight without lights on the car trip to their grandmother's house to avoid what was going to happen in their village are in this picture. Top row, third from to the left, from the right-hand side is my cousin Julius. And then there is a woman from the left side, third in, and that's my cousin Helen. My mother told me she made a promise to God that if she survived the Nazi Holocaust, she would keep up with her Jewish faith. She kept this promise until the day she died at the age of 102. I am showing you now the prayer book my mother kept with her all the days in Germany, on her trip to the United States, in the hold of the ship, and had with her till her last dying day. And it is a prayer book I now have. Thank you for listening. I'm ready to take questions if you have any.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions. So our first is you had mentioned that wow, it just moved. Sorry. You mentioned that you had returned or gone to Germany and seen the home several years ago. What was that like?
It was an amazing spirit. A very kind Lutheran minister who had served in this small town was my guide. I had corresponded with him before arriving in this small town of Hobach, and he was able to take me throughout the village. And still existing is the home that you see in the picture. Of course, now it has all kinds of electronics attached to it. I had wanted to go inside, but the homeowner was not comfortable letting me do so. But it was really, really exciting for me to see this house.
And did your mother ever or any other family members go back to Germany?
My mother never went back and actually asked me never to go back, and therefore I did not return to Germany till after my mother passed away. I do have cousins who have gone back on what I will refer to as roots trips to, as I did, learn more.
And then where did you get, the images and the items that you were able to show, like the recipe and the schoolwork?
The recipe was one I have in my mother's handwriting when I asked her to write it down for me. And the other items, I showed you a straw basket, and those items, the handiwork items, were in the straw basket. They obviously must have meant a great deal to my mother since that was the only thing that held any belongings. And I do have those in my possession.
And did your father ever talk about his experience?
He didn't. Um, Neither of my parents did, and therefore I still have some loopholes I've been not able to close on my mother's side, especially. I feel my father's was more straightforward and not so unusual, whereas my mother's was.
So when did you first start kind of hearing some of your mother's story?
You know, as my mother didn't talk about it. It was very rare. Uh, and when she did, it was not to me directly. And I think that was, she thought she was probably protecting me. But once my mother passed away, I really wanted to start to dig into things and spend quite a bit of time talking to cousins who came over and learning what I could from them, my own trip, my own roots trip to learn what I could by visiting cemeteries and homes in different little villages in the area. And so my interest was very spiked, and it's, of course, my interest in the Illinois Holocaust Museum, too.
What happened with your grandmother? Did she also go to North Dakota?
No, my grandmother, I don't know if you'd say she was the smart one or not. She stayed in New York City and lived with my mother's brother, Manny, and she lived to about the age of 80. I unfortunately did not get to see her very often, but we did make trips there about once every year, every other year, and I got to see my grandmother, Matilda.
Right. When did you get involved with the museum? Why?
Okay, I got involved with the museum right at the phase where they were building it, the building that we have our museum in now. And it was a couple of reasons. The first, of course, was I wanted to be able for people to learn about the Holocaust and what happened as a result of the Nazis. And so it was good timing as well. It was a time where I was getting closer to my retirement years, and I thought, oh, this would be a great way to volunteer. And so I've been more and more interested in it as the years have passed and as the museum has begun teaching about so many atrocities that have happened in the world.
Okay, one last question, I think, as of right now. What do you want people to kind of take away from hearing your mother's story?
I'd like them to know that, first of all, people who are need to stand up for themselves. They need to be brave. They need to put themselves out there. And I think my mother only survived this because she had this extremely tough work ethic and ability to say, I'm going to get through this. I'm going to make it work, and then I'll be able to escape and take my mother with me. So I think it's this just standing up for yourself and putting your face forward and doing the best you can to move ahead.
Brilliant. That looks like that's all the questions we have right now. So I will let you say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you, everyone who's been listening. I appreciate you letting me share my story with you and hope you learn from it as I learn every day. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.